Hey there, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our December 2024 SFAR Forms update. Uh, in place of Eric, I have Dan Hershkowitz pinch hitting, and we are going to go through the Forms update for the SFAR form set. And this release will be coming down the pike tentatively December the 17th, which is a Tuesday. Dan, I think we're trying to tie it to the car release. Is that your understanding? That's when the release is coming down?
In my mind, it was the 14th. I could double check,
Oh,
but
no, that's fine. They'll be around each other. The point being, it's an opportunity for everybody to spend some time during the holidays getting up to date on their most important forms. Um, quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I've already updated two forms, relatively minor updates to function. This was done in early November. We are also going to be retiring the buyer broker compensation addendum. For those of you that may remember, this is a form that was introduced earlier this year. And then specifically significant updates to our purchase agreement, minor updates to the counteroffer, multiple counteroffer, a pretty sizable update to the San Francisco seller disclosure and the contingency removal, as well as a small revision to the as-is addendum.
and by the way, you were right.
Yeah.
It is the 17th. The
Oh,
14th
phew.
is on the weekend, so
All right.
that's definitely not right.
With any luck, we'll both be landing at the same time. Um, for those practitioners that are in the middle of transactions, I don't anticipate this resulting in any significant change for you for any ongoing transactions. But if you are jumping into a new transaction after the 17th, make sure that you update your templates in whatever your platform is of choice for form filling. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to for regards to San Francisco forms to forms, FORMS, at sfrealtors.com. All right, so the first change that was already implemented back in November was a change to the security deposit interest calculation form. In particular, once the rent board published the updated rent board fee for this next time period, 2024 through 2025, which remains unchanged, we had to incrementally increase the number of years that this has been. So if you're using this form when you're calculating interest on security deposits and deducting rent board fees that may not have been previously collected, the form is now up to date. No change for you guys. Just make sure that you're aware that the change is done. The next thing was a small revision to the termination of agreement form in the advisory portion. So recall this is a two-page form. In the advisory portion, we had an incorrect paragraph reference dating back to our forms update in August of this year. It referred to a specific paragraph number. We simply changed it so that it referred to the termination paragraph, which is the bolded name next to the paragraph number. So that should be resolved. So again, changes coming down the pike on the 17th of December. This is tentative because I haven't been able to confirm with our forms filling platforms that this will be live, but I have every reason to believe 99% confident that this will remain the case. If there is a change, certainly we will be in touch using our normal modes, social media, email, blast from the association. All right, so the buyer broker compensation addendum, as I already referenced, will be retired on the 17th. CAR is retiring the seller payment buyer broker form at the same time that they do their forms update. Is that correct, Dan?
That is 100% right.
Okay. And so once that form goes away, our workaround would no longer be effective. And so the big change that we're going to be talking about today really deals with how are we going to handle a request from the buyer to the seller to participate in the payment of the buyer's broker. So that's going away. Let's dig into those big changes. So the San Francisco purchase agreement, first, structurally is going to look different. It is now going to be 10 pages, not because there's been a whole bunch of changes in content. We took this as an opportunity to increase the font size. We also did add a new paragraph that deals with the buyer's broker compensation concept. We did a little bit of reorganization. So for those of you that sort of have memorized paragraph references, pay careful attention. They have moved a little bit. And then just a little bit of housekeeping. We took care of updating any internal paragraph references in the document, and that applies also to our contingency removal. So here's the big concept. We have a new optional paragraph 5 in our purchase agreement. It will appear at the top of the second page of the form, and you'll notice there is an if checked format And then it goes on to talk about a credit from the seller to the buyer. Of course, this is in the offer form when it's initially submitted. So the buyer is requesting this. They would check the box. And if the seller elects to give a credit, and I emphasize the language of election, then we have split the types of credits into two different concepts. And I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So again, it's if checked. I will say that we've requested through our forms filling platforms that if a dollar amount or if a percentage, and I'll get to that in a second, is filled in, that it will force this box to be checked. But understand that this paragraph is only incorporated into an offer if the checkbox is checked and if something is filled in. Otherwise, you're not really requesting that the seller credit you for anything. So again, we've segregated two different kinds of credits. The first type deals with the buyer's cost of sale and ownership, and really you should think of this as sort of the catch-all credit. It is basically everything except for credits dealing with the buyer's obligation to pay their broker. So it can be applied towards third-party fees like credit for escrow, lenders, fees, points, things like that. It could also be a reimbursement for inspection reports. It could even be used for things such as carrying costs in the future, right? So the buyer is requesting some amount of money to help them with their ownership before they have to be fully responsible. This
Let
is
me
a
jump
dollar
in
amount.
just
Go
for a
ahead.
minute there.
Yeah.
So, in fact, what I like to point out sometimes to my agents is that money is fungible. We don't need to say what it's for, right? So, the buyer has a contractual obligation to bring to the table their down payment plus closing costs. And depending on what they choose, their closing costs may be higher, maybe lower, right? They could put a home warranty in there if they wanted to. They could pay down some points on their loan, right? So their closing costs, let's just give an example, 20% plus their closing costs. And it's often been the case, and it was the case when I bought my first home, that I was able to take on a higher mortgage and comfortably so, but I didn't have a lot of cash. And so I made an offer of, and at the time, I'll just tell you the numbers, $310,000 instead of $300,000, and asked the buyer to give me a credit towards my closing costs of $10,000. That's what A is. 5A is simply that. And use it however you want to use it. In the old days, we were writing that in and we were searching for the right words. And what were the right words, right? Was it towards closing costs? Was it towards non-recurring closing costs? Well, these are the right words. And that it's as easy as checking the box and filling in an amount. In a moment, Neil's going to tell you the distinction between that, which is the old seller to credit you towards your closing costs to be used for whatever you want,
Mm-hmm.
or 5B that says, oh, we're going to use them for this very specific purpose. And now I think perhaps you can go into that.
Yeah. So just reiterating everything that we just went over, A is for everything except the buyer's obligation. So there's a paragraph that comes in between A and B, and it has some language that came from the NAR settlement, and I think it may also be part of some upcoming laws. See our other video about upcoming laws and changes. So I will read this aloud. The amount or rate of real estate commission is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between the seller and the broker, or parenthetically, we've included or buyer and broker, as the case may be. And so that language is there. It is deliberate in the way that we have laid out the paragraph so that there is space between the first concept of credits and this other concept of credits. Again, all of this being optional. And so when you as a practitioner you have a buyer rep agreement, your buyer is asking you to have the seller help them pay you. We've provided two options. They're not exclusive to one another. You can actually do both if you want. The first option is check the box, some percentage of the final sales price. You'll notice there is a blank that allows, if you fill in the percentage, that checkbox should automatically check, and it will, in the parenthetical that follows the percent of final purchase price, calculate that. Is that the final number? It depends. If you end up negotiating a price reduction, price goes up because the seller makes a counter, fine. If they agree to this term, the percentage is maintained and will adjust according to whatever the final purchase price is. So don't get bogged down in the parenthetical. It's just there as you're going through offers as a listing agent to compare. You can quickly see, okay, this percentage is this. How does this affect the net number for my seller? Seller, what would you like to do? The other option is, if checked, a flat amount, and that amount doesn't vary with the purchase price. So for those of you that are entering into a structure where you're collecting a flat fee for representing the buyer, you can fill in that dollar amount and still request that the buyer can make the request to the seller that they pay some or all of that amount. The next part is a paragraph that actually explains what this optional credit can be applied toward and is specifically for payment of the buyer's broker's obligation. So I'm going to ask you a question here, Dan. Different than CAR's implementation in their purchase agreement is that in CAR, the representation is made by the buyer that they have a valid written, or they have a written agreement, and that's it. There's no fork to get the buyer to turn over a copy or a portion of the BRBC or whatever buyer rep agreement is being used. Correct?
Mm. It is more than just that representation. It's a representation that there's an existing buyer representation agreement, buyer broker agreement, that it's in force and effect now and with regards to this property.
Okay.
That the amount being requested here does not exceed the amount that's in there.
In the buyer rep agreement.
Right. It doesn't go on to the next thing and say, and you got to prove it to us. Why? Well, CAR took the approach at my urging, frankly, we don't need to be the police of this. And I don't want to put my agents in a position where not asking becomes perhaps falling below the standard of care. So instead, the CAR form makes it a representation. I am representing to you that these things are true. If the buyer is lying and if their agent is helping them lie at that point, well, that's a problem. But we have some solutions for that, which is ethics in the Department of Real Estate, right?
Sure.
Which have always been a solution for that. However, quite reasonably here, there are those representations and this within 2-day option, and perhaps you want to go into that.
Yeah. So ours differs. We took a different philosophical approach, and we gave the seller the power to request evidence of the buyer representation agreement so that they could make sure that, for instance, the amount of the credit doesn't exceed whatever was agreed to in their valid buyer representation agreement. And the process for that will utilize our notice to perform. If upon a written request, the buyer chooses not to turn over evidence of that buyer rep agreement, then the seller may issue a notice to perform enforcing the contractual obligation to turn it over. And if after those 2 days, it doesn't result in termination of the agreement. So if you're a buyer's agent, you're not out of, you don't get kicked out of contract. What ends up happening is that credit can go away, right? So the contract remains, but whatever credit may have been agreed to is not going to be enforceable. So this could make a significant financial change for a buyer who really needs that credit to pay their broker or needs that money to close the transaction. So just keep that in mind. We did take a different approach.
Let's be honest about what it means. It would mean that you're not getting paid as the buyer's agent. And so if you were pulling a shenanigan and you really didn't have a buyer broker agreement signed for X percent that you're asking for, your client is asking for in the purchase agreement at the time you submitted this purchase agreement, right? And they ask you for one and you can't produce one, and the seller says, hey, we're not going to pay, right? The buyer's still buying, right? And now the question is, how are you gonna try to enforce your agreement against the buyer, which agreement you may not have had at the right time? So it's interesting.
Again, we'll sort of see how this shakes out over time. I know that the concept that money is fungible is, I love that concept, and I wish that we could just unilaterally have a single blank credit for any purpose because money is truly fungible. But many lenders required this distinction, and therefore we've included it and giving you a pathway to be able to request this credit separate from any other credits. Go
Can
ahead.
we run with that for 1 second? And
Yeah,
can
of
you
course.
go back to show us what it looks like in the contract, the 5A and the 5B?
Yep. Give me one sec.
That one, right. And so, as a reminder, let's say your client asks for $50,000 in 5A.
Mhm.
Okay. Your client can use that $50,000 for whatever they want. Before you ask for $50,000, you, as the buyer's agent, should be calling the lender and saying, hey, we're about to write an offer that says $50,000 credit. Is that okay? Right? Because the buyer can't walk away with money. The lender's not going to let that happen. And so if that exceeds their actual closing costs, right, and their other obligations, well, that's not going to work for the lender. So let's assume, by the way, for a jumbo mortgage, it's typically 6%, which is more
Mhm.
than what most people think. So for $1 million jumbo mortgage, 6%.
Mhm.
What I can't remember now is if it's 6% of the price or 6% of the loan
The loan
amount.
amount. Check with your lender, obviously.
Yeah, I can't remember. But anyhow, assuming your client can use that $50,000 for anything because money's fungible. And
Mhm.
if your client is not also utilizing 5B, and by the way, they both can be utilized at the same time.
Mhm.
If your client is not also utilizing 5B, then what that means is that your client is paying you your compensation as a closing cost through the transaction. And your client may have many reasons to want to do that rather
Mhm.
than increase, in essence, the purchase price and fold it into the contract and the loan, which is what we've been doing for years. And basically what 5B does. That's totally up to your client. And so for your client who says, hey, I got a bunch of cash. Now I realize one of the things I need to do with my cash is also pay you, agent X%. That makes me think, you know what? Instead of asking for a $20,000 credit, let's ask for a little more. Can we ask for a $40,000 credit? Great. They can do that.
Yep.
Perfectly acceptable. Or if they choose, and or if they choose to ask in 5B, the good news is, as Neal alluded to earlier, the lenders segregate these two concepts. And so 5A, the lenders will be calculating, okay, we only allow up to 6%. Does this exceed that? Right? If it
Mhm.
doesn't, mazel tov, go ahead. What they don't do is they don't then add to that number 5B. Why? Because 5B is a direct payment, it turns out, from the seller, a direct credit to you, the broker, right? The buyer's broker. And they count that separately. Why? Because it's just the allocation of an existing obligation, and the contract itself allocates a whole bunch of different obligations between the parties. I'll give you one good example: transfer tax,
Mhm.
HOA fees, right? The parties are already contracted for who's going to pay those existing obligations. And the lender doesn't think about and calculate those, and it won't think about and calculate this either. Okay?
Yep.
Thank you for letting me
Perfect.
do that.
Thank you. And just to put a little icing on that cake, um, paragraph C really is the emphatic encouragement that a buyer consult with their lender in advance of making an offer like this to make sure that the total amount of credits don't exceed what's permissible, because in paragraph 13, our financing provision, there is a specific statement that says any credits in excess of lender limits shall be reduced without adjustment to the purchase price. So again, if you're that buyer and you've gone over whatever the allowable limits are from the lender, you may be left holding the bag. So protect your buyers and protect your payment. All right, the next change, as you know, we're retiring that buyer broker compensation addendum. So the checkbox for that is now gone under the contract addenda paragraph where you would check boxes. And we've added just a small clarifier to the contingencies and documents delivery grid under section 11, specifically dealing with insurance, that just reminds everybody that the buyer may specify an annual premium limit in the insurance contingency. Don't have to. If you don't, then it's left up to buyer sole discretion. But some buyers may want to be a little bit more competitive, fill in a dollar amount, and this will allow a seller to differentiate between two offers, one where a premium amount is filled in or not. The next big change deals with combining two paragraphs. So for those of you that are familiar with the purchase agreement now, our paragraph 18A and B include reference to the San Francisco seller disclosure, and then there was a separate paragraph that dealt with seller's obligation to provide other documents. And some practitioners felt that the other documents term was overly broad, or how could they recommend to a buyer that it would be relatively safe, not risk-free, but relatively safe to go ahead and remove the contingency around this concept. So we rejiggered Section E of the San Francisco seller disclosure, which Dan and I have done a lot of work on over the years, that was a list of different sorts of documents that might be in a seller's possession. Not exhaustive, but it was a rather lengthy list that included a bunch of bullet points. And now you'll see when we get to it, they're check boxes, and we're asking that sellers actually indicate the documents that they have in their possession, as well as attach them if they're in their possession or control. This paragraph is rejiggered to not as much as you would think. Still in there is the definition of what is completing the San Francisco seller disclosure, but then it also includes the obligation to attach the documents to that disclosure form that are in their possession. And again, it has a list that sort of mirrors what's in the San Francisco seller disclosure.
May I say, for anyone who's feeling bent out of shape that this is a burden to, in essence, attach anything and everything related to the property, so too does the California Association of Realtors form require. So too does its SPQ, which is the state version of the San Francisco seller disclosure. And so do all of the attorneys who are practicing in this area say the law requires, regardless of what the contract says.
Yeah, I can already hear people, and I'm sure Dan's referencing it, that this is a big burden, a big lift. Many of us as practitioners have had that experience where we closed a transaction and you show up at the house and the seller has left a box of stuff in the house that pertains to the house. And maybe it's like warranties and models information, and maybe it's repair estimates, things like that. And it's not for us as practitioners to determine, gosh, was that material? Would this have made a difference? But certainly we've been in the many of us have been in the instance where a buyer has said, God, if I had known that, I would have done X or Y. And so again, we're just trying to help you encourage sellers to make a full and complete disclosure. And undoubtedly, it is still up to the buyer to decide when they're satisfied, right? In fact, paragraph 20, which was our old paragraph 25, moves up and reminds us that any new material facts should still be disclosed, and again reiterates that agents can't determine whether it is new or material, but the obligation falls not only on the seller but also on the seller's agent if they become aware of a fact that materially affects the desirability. Gosh, you probably all say it along with me. Affects the desirability of the property, that it should be disclosed.
Adversely impacts the value or desirability of the property.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's the end of the changes to the purchase agreement. The next changes just bring the counteroffer and the multiple counteroffer into line. So we've added a third item under terms. It says, unless otherwise agreed to in writing below or in another counteroffer, any seller credits to buyer expressed as a percentage will be maintained in the same percentage of the final purchase price. So again, trying to capture that concept of when you're giving a credit to help pay for the buyer's payment to buyer's broker, that it will adjust no matter what happens to the purchase price.
When expressed as a percentage. But what I find funny about that is that's a truism, as they say, right?
It is.
Yeah. But it also is helpful because if that's there, what are the two above it, right? And this is a reminder to be reading the two above, right? And here's where this form works a little bit different than the car form in terms of the the initial deposit, right? And so the initial deposit and the loan amounts both will move as percentages of the new purchase price when there's a counteroffer that changes the price.
Yep. I do find that a lot of practitioners who deal mostly in car land struggle with this. A lot of practitioners that are here struggle when they go to car land. And I will say I used to do a lot of file review when I managed, and to all you agents that are out there writing immediately after you write a different price and all other terms remain the same, you're canceling out some of this good work that we've done on your behalf. So it can be confusing. Well, what is the initial deposit now? Did it adjust? Well, no, you said all terms remain the same, so maybe it doesn't adjust. Do yourself a favor. Trust that we put in some good work, and unless you really don't want anything else to change, you don't need to include that specific clause. Here are the changes to the San Francisco seller disclosure, as I mentioned. So again, if you mark yes to Section E, please indicate the documents that are in your possession or control. What's the difference between possession and control? Possession is you have them. Control is there's some place where you could get them reasonably and produce them. And we've provided a list. You can check the boxes for the things that you have. We've also provided some other check boxes so that if it's something that falls outside of the things that we've specified, you still have space to include it. Please, please, please check the boxes for what you have, and please attach them if you have them.
May I say this? Often we talk about reviewing disclosures with a buyer and looking for red flags, and we think about yes answers as red flags. I would say that as a listing agent who's reviewing what your client has done, that's one of your jobs as a listing agent, is to make sure that your clients have accurately and completely filled out their disclosures. And one red flag for you, and likewise a red flag for a buyer, would be a no answer to E, right? No, you don't have any of these things. How is that possible, right? And so certainly as the listing agent, right, you need to make sure, listen, hold on a moment. You don't have in your possession or control or on your computer all of the documents from when you bought it, right? Or you don't have a drawer here in the house somewhere with estimates reports that relate to the whatever it might be, the roof, the windows, the whatever, right? That would be its own red flag at this point. Okay.
No, I think that's a great point. And you know, if you've owned the property forever, you know some stuff. And even if it was, there was a leak 30 years ago, we used to get water over the foundation, but we put in a French drain, and it now the water doesn't come in over. That's a disclosure. That's something that you should say if you're aware of it. And again, the standard is, are you aware? And sure, people forget, or things happen. But the reality is that you should make a good faith effort to fully disclose what you know about the property, because it may be material to the buyer, and it's not for you or your seller to make that determination.
And just for fun there, the French drain is a great example. So it turns out that you did do the work, your client did the work,
Mhm,
and they chose the bid that was $6,000.
mhm.
And then they wrote, we haven't had a problem since. But there was another bid that was $66,000. And it said the only best way to do this is to do the following. And that's substantially more than the $6,000 bid. And yeah, you didn't have any problems because it hadn't rained in those 8 months, right? And now there's a buyer and it does have a flooding again. And they subpoena all the documents, including the $66,000 bid, and say, why didn't you give us this? Right. And the answer is,
Yeah,
I didn't want to give you that because it looks bad. I wanted to give you one that looks good. Well, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
that's great. That's a great example. Um, the second to last change is we removed a clause from the as is addendum, so 1F, because a practitioner pointed out that they thought that it could potentially be interpreted to contradict the informational access that exists in our investigation paragraph. Section B, in a box, it says that the buyer shall have reasonable access to the property for informational purposes for a period of time after acceptance, and that it is separate from the buyer's investigation contingency. So even if that contingency is removed, that the buyer could have access. Many of us use this to bring in people to measure, figure out, start to think about permits for work after we close. That is not around a contingency. But if the as is addendum was incorporated into your purchase agreement, and I know many practitioners will include the as is addendum in their disclosure package, and some people out there just sign it and turn it in along with the documents, and I would argue that that is incorporated into your purchase agreement whether you intended it or not. Some people were concerned that this phrase will preclude buyer from entering upon the property somehow contradicted informational access, so we've removed it. Now, if a seller really doesn't want a buyer coming into the property for some reason, then they can counter out informational access, or they can reduce it to a period of time that they're comfortable with. And then lastly, we updated the contingency removal just to bring it into line with the purchase agreement, all the updated paragraph numbers. And that is not on the screen, but you see the top of the page. You're familiar with it. Nothing else has changed in that form other than the paragraph references and the removal of the other seller documents that is now lumped in under the San Francisco seller disclosure. So as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can reach us at forms@sfrealtors.com. And we are planning on doing a webinar sometime during the week of the 9th of December. Dan, myself, and Eric will be available. We'll go over some of these changes again and be available to answer questions that you may have about this. So if you aren't getting the response you need from the emails, feel free to reach out and certainly stay tuned if you want to attend the webinar. I know the association will push out some information around that. Dan, you have anything before we wrap up?
No, I just want to say that Eric is the one who also deserves the credit. You and Eric were chair and vice chair and have done a wonderful job on this committee. I am merely a legacy, and I am smart and I do know stuff, and I'm thrilled to be here to be part of this. So thank you. I don't discount that, but Eric and you did the real lifting, and I want to thank you both.
Thank you, Dan. You are a treasure, and we're very blessed. The participants we have on the Standard Forms Committee, those practitioners who put in hours and hours and hours, unpaid realtors who are just doing this for the good of the community. We're lucky to have them, and certainly we're lucky to have you. Thank you so much for everything you do. And Eric, I hope you're having a good Thanksgiving wherever you are. Thank you so much for all your hard work. All
Thank
right,
you, Eric.
everybody.